iLearner. Learn today, lead tomorrow.
Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're getting into a pretty important document when it comes to safety in the oil and gas industry.
Oh, yeah, definitely. A very important document.
Yeah, so this is API 505.
Okay.
You probably heard of it if you're in the industry. The full title's a bit of a mouthful, though.
It is a mouthful.
Recommended practice for classification of locations for electrical installations at petroleum facilities classified as Class Y, Zone 0, Zone 1, and Zone 2.
Yeah. We're basically trying to keep things from blowing up.
Exactly. You know, those videos you see online of oil rig fires and explosions?
Absolutely.
That's the kind of thing API 505 is trying to prevent.
Yeah, and it's amazing how, just a little spark from some electrical equipment can cause a huge problem in those environments.
Yeah. So this whole document is all about classifying different areas in a facility, based on how likely they are to have flammable gases or vapors present.
Exactly. So you know what kind of electrical equipment you can safely use in each spot.
Makes sense. So it's like you wouldn't use the same electrical outlet in your garage next to a gas can that you would use in your living room.
Absolutely not.
So how does API 505 actually work? Does it lay out specific rules for every single piece of equipment?
Well, not exactly. It's more about classifying the location itself based on the risk level. Like how likely is it that there's going to be a flammable gas or vapor in that area? And then once you know the risk level, you can refer to other standards to actually choose the equipment.
So it's like a kind of two-step process.
Yeah, you could think of it like that.
So what are some of those other standards that API 505 would work with?
Well, there's the National Electrical Code. That's a big one.
Oh, yeah. I've heard of that.
And then API actually has its own standard, too, 14FZ, for electrical installations in hazardous locations.
Oh, okay. So API's got its own set of guidelines to build on top of this initial risk assessment.
Exactly. So it's all about kind of a layered approach to safety.
Okay. Now, I've heard that there are different classification systems out there. Like there's a zone system and a division system.
You're exactly right. It can get a little confusing.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So how do those two systems fit in with API 505?
Well, API 505 specifically focuses on the zone system.
Okay.
And there's another API document, API 500, that uses the division system. They're both aimed at kind of doing the same thing, assessing risk, but they just go about it in slightly different ways.
Got it. So we just need to keep those two systems straight in our heads. What exactly does API 505 cover, and what does it lease out?
Okay, so this is super important. API 505 is only about flammable gases and liquids. Things like gasoline or propane. If you're dealing with something else that's hazardous, like combustible dust or ignitable fibers, you'll need to consult a different standard altogether.
So no mixing and matching hazards. Flammable gases and liquids only.
Precisely.
Okay. Now, I'm thinking about how diverse the petroleum industry is, right?
Right.
I mean, you've got everything from offshore drilling rigs to, pipeline facilities and refineries. Does API 505 really apply to all of those different environments?
It does, and that's one of the things that makes it so useful. They actually structured the document in a way that addresses the unique challenges of each of those settings. They've got sections for mobile offshore drilling units. They call those MODUs.
MODUs.
And then sections on floating production platforms like tension leg platforms and FPSOs, and of course pipeline transportation facilities, pump stations and things like that.
That's a lot to cover.
Yeah.
Sounds like they really tried to make this a comprehensive document.
They definitely did.
But before we get too far into how API 505 classifies all these different areas, I think it's important to understand some of the key concepts that it's based on.
Definitely.
Right? So, what are some of those terms that are really important to understand?
Well, first off, they make a clear distinction between a flammable liquid and a combustible liquid.
Okay, so what's the difference there?
It all comes down to that flash point we talked about earlier. Remember, that's the lowest temperature at which a liquid can give off enough vapor to ignite.
Right. High school chemistry is slowly coming back to me.
So flammable liquids have a flash point below 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
And combustible liquids have a flash point at or above 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
So flammable liquids are basically more likely to ignite at typical temperatures.
Exactly. They pose a greater risk at room temperature, for example.
Got it.
And then they also talk about different categories of flammable gases. They group them into IIA, IIB, and IC.
Why do they need to categorize the gases like that?
Well, not all flammable gases are created equal.
Of course.
Some are much easier to ignite than others.
So some are like kindling and others are like big logs.
That's a great analogy. Exactly. And the grouping, it's based on how easily they can be ignited by a spark.
So IC would be like the really sensitive ones, the ones that you barely need a spark to set them off.
Exactly. And they even get into some really specific tests to determine how easily a spark can cause an explosion in the presence of a particular gas.
Okay, now we're getting a little technical.
We are, but these are important concepts. Like they talk about something called the maximum experimental safe gap, or ME-SG.
ME-SG, okay.
And the minimum igniting current, or MIC.
MIC. All right, so what do those actually tell us?
So imagine you have a spark, right? And you've got a gap, like a physical gap between two pieces of metal.
Okay.
The MESG tells you the smallest gap that will prevent that spark from igniting the gas.
So if the gap is smaller than the MESG, you're in trouble.
Exactly. And the MIC, that tells you the smallest amount of electrical current that can cause a spark big enough to ignite the gas.
Okay, so it's all about understanding how easily a spark can jump across a gap and cause a big boom.
Pretty much.
So I'm starting to see why all of this is important. It's about knowing the specific risks associated with each substance and taking the right precautions.
You got it. And this is all just the foundation for actually classifying those hazardous areas.
Okay, so now we're ready to talk about those zones.
We are, but I think that's a great place to pause for now.
All right, so we've laid the groundwork, we've got our basic definitions down, and next time we're going to dive into what makes a zone 0 different from a zone 1 or zone 2.
That's exactly right. Stay tuned. All right, so we left off talking about those zones, remember?
Yeah, the zone system for classifying hazardous areas.
Right, so it's important to understand that this whole system, it's basically a way to assess the risk in different areas of a facility. So you've got Zone 0, Zone 1, and Zone 2. Think of it like a spectrum of risk. Zone 0 is the most hazardous.
Okay, so zone 0 is like red alert, danger zone.
Pretty much. You don't want to mess around in a Zone 0 area. This is where a flammable atmosphere is present all the time, or at least for long periods.
Okay, so like right next to an open tank of gasoline.
Exactly. Or any area where there are frequent leaks of flammable gases or vapors. Because of that constant risk, only specially designed electrical equipment is allowed in Zone 0 areas.
The kind of equipment that's completely sealed and spark-proof.
You got it. Because any little spark in a Zone 0 area could be disastrous.
Makes sense. So what about zone 1? Is that a little less risky?
Exactly. Zone 1 is where a flammable atmosphere is likely to occur under normal operating conditions. But it's not always present like in Zone 0. Think of it like areas around pumps and valves, or maybe flanges, places where leaks might happen occasionally.
So it's still risky, but not like a constant state of emergency.
Right. You still need to be careful and use the right equipment, but it doesn't have to be as extreme as Zone 0.
Got it. So zone 2 must be the least hazardous of the three.
Exactly. Zone 2 is where a flammable atmosphere is only likely under abnormal conditions, like if there's a major equipment failure or a big spill. So it's still important to have safeguards, but the overall risk is much lower.
So it all comes down to how likely it is for a flammable atmosphere to form and how long it might last.
Exactly. The more likely and the longer it lasts, the higher the risk, and the more stringent the safety requirements.
That makes sense. But it sounds pretty complicated to actually classify these areas, right?
It can be, but that's where API 505 really shines. It provides a ton of practical examples and specific guidance for classifying different areas. Like Section 8, it's got examples for everything. Tank storage, loading and unloading operations, vents, even laboratory rooms.
Okay, so it's not just a bunch of abstract concepts and definitions. There's actual real-world stuff in there.
Absolutely. It's like a toolbox for figuring out how to classify these areas.
But wouldn't the classification also depend on what kind of substances you're dealing with? Like a tank of gasoline versus a tank of propane.
You're right on the money. And API 505 takes that into account, too.
Okay, so can you give me an example? Like, how does that work in practice?
Sure. Think about tank truck loading and unloading. API 505 actually makes a distinction between locations where tank trucks unload liquefied gas through the dome and those that unload flammable liquids.
Wait, why would there be a difference? Aren't they both dealing with flammable substances?
They are, but the key is how those substances behave. Liquefied gases, like propane, they're stored under pressure. So when they're released, they vaporize really quickly.
Oh, okay.
And that creates a much bigger flammable cloud compared to a regular flammable liquid like gasoline.
So even though both scenarios involve tank trucks, the risk assessment is different because of the way those substances are handled.
Exactly. It's all about those little details, you know?
Fascinating. So API 505 takes all of that into account.
Yep. And they dive into even more detail when it comes to specific industries. Like, they have whole sections dedicated to refineries, drilling rigs, offshore platforms, even pipeline transportation facilities.
Wow. So it's tailored to the unique challenges of each sector.
Precisely. So, for example, in the section on drilling rigs, they actually have different classifications for mud tanks depending on their location.
Mud tanks, those big tanks they use in drilling operations.
Exactly. If a mud tank is in a wide-open, well-ventilated area, the risk is lower. But if it's enclosed and poorly ventilated, the risk is much higher.
Because those flammable vapors can build up.
Exactly. So the location of the tank can actually change how you classify the area.
That makes sense. So it's not just about the substance, but also the environment.
Right. It's all interconnected.
Okay. This is pretty in-depth stuff. Is there anything else about API 505 that you think is really important for people to know?
Well, one thing that I think is really interesting is that API 505 actually offers an alternative method for classifying areas. It's in Annex D of the document.
Okay, an alternative method. So there's more than one way to do this.
In a way, yeah. This alternative method, it's based on something called the point source concept.
Point source. What's that?
So basically, it uses the material's volatility and release rate to determine how big the classified area needs to be.
So it's a different way of calculating the risk zone.
Yeah, you could think of it like that. It's a bit more complex than the standard zone system, but it can be more accurate in some cases.
This is a like more advanced tool for specific situations.
Exactly. And API 505 acknowledges that this method might be more appropriate in certain cases.
Okay, so we've got our standard zone system, and we've got this alternative point source method for those who really want to get into the weeds. This is a lot to take in.
It is. And remember, this is just our interpretation of API 505. The actual document itself has even more details.
Right. We always encourage people to read the source material themselves. But before we wrap things up, any final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with about API 505?
One thing I think is really crucial is to remember that even small changes to a process or a piece of equipment can change the hazardous area classification.
Oh, wow. So it's not just a set it and forget it kind of thing.
Definitely not. It's super important to be vigilant and review those classifications regularly and always err on the side of caution.
Good advice.
Right.
Well, I think we've given everyone a pretty good overview of API 505. It really makes you think about all the work that goes on behind the scenes to keep things safe in these industries.
Yeah, absolutely. Safety's got to be the top priority, you know, when you're dealing with these kinds of hazards.
Yeah. It's easy to forget about all that when you're just filling up your car at the gas station.
Right.
But yeah, I think API 505, it's a really good example of how standards and regulations can really make a difference.
They're lifesavers, really.
For sure. Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of explaining the basics of API 505.
Yeah, I think so. I hope so.
But of course, this is just, a high-level overview.
Right.
So we always encourage everyone to actually read the document itself, get all the details.
Absolutely. There's so much great information in there.
Yeah. And if you have any questions or maybe you've got some experience using API 505 in the field, head over to our YouTube channel and leave a comment. We'd love to hear from you.
We love hearing from you guys. Always interesting, always insightful.
Next. All right. Well, that's it for our deep dive into API 505.
Until next time.
Stay curious. Stay safe.
Hello.